the Weekly Show with David J. Maloney. This week, David chats with iconic actor Henry Thomas. And now, here's your host, David J. Maloney.
On tonight's show, we've got a really special guest. He originally won our hearts the very first time most of us saw him as the little boy Elliot in one of the most iconic films of all time, Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extra Terrestrial. He then exploded back into many of our lives with recent roles in The Haunting of Hill House, Bly Manor, Dr. Sleep, and Midnight Mass. With us tonight is none other than Henry Thomas. So don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. Our featured guest tonight came into most of our lives with his role of the little boy Elliot in one of the most iconic films of all time, Steven Spielberg's E.T. the Extra Terrestrial. And he's only added to his incredible legacy with stellar roles in The Haunting of Hill House, Bly Manor, Midnight Mass, and Dr. Sleep, with his incredible collaboration with writer and director Mike Flanagan. Here to chat about his life and career is Henry Thomas himself. Henry, welcome to the show.
Thanks for having me on.
Henry, there's so much I want to talk to you about, but I wonder if we could start off with just a little biography. You came into the spotlight early in life, as we all know, but what was life like before E.T., before Raggedy Man?
Well, I grew up in Texas, sort of south central Texas, not far from San Antonio. And my parents were kind of, hobby farmers on the weekends. And I just kind of fell into the arts in a very strange way through piano lessons and regional theater. And then I landed a part in a film called Raggedy Man in 1981, we filmed it in 1980. And that sort of set the path for me to go to Universal and meet Spielberg and all of that stuff that led to where I am now.
And I didn't know this actually until I started doing research, but that is correct. Your first film wasn't E.T., but Raggedy Man with Sissy Spacek. I didn't have any idea. How did that first role itself come about?
Well, that happened through a random audition that happened in San Antonio, Texas. They advertised, the casting agents advertised on the news and the radio that they were holding an open call audition at a Holiday Inn in downtown San Antonio. And I said, "Oh, Mom, Dad, I've got to go to that. I've got to go." And they said, "Well, okay, we'll take you. But don't get your hopes up, because there's a lot of kids." So I went, and the audition process felt like a long time, but I think, for a kid, time is kind of distended. But I think it probably took about 2.5 or 3 weeks, and I ended up getting the part. And that film shot in Texas, not far from where I grew up.
What was the first moment that started the journey of you getting cast in E.T.? I mean, did you have an agent call you or your parents? Did you all see an ad in the paper? Was it a news thing like you said? I mean, what were the events that led up to your audition for that role?
Well, I didn't have an agent. No agent would represent me because I lived in Texas. And they said, "You have to move to LA if you're serious about this, because we don't want to deal with, an out-of-state client." And my parents didn't want to take that step. I mean, they had a simple life and they liked it that way. But basically, Sissy Spacek and her husband, Jack Fisk, who was the director of Raggedy Man, they kind of acted as our guide into the business because we didn't know anything. And, Jack was editing Raggedy Man across the hall from Spielberg while he was working on the initial, rough of Poltergeist, I think it was at the time. And he had heard through the grapevine that Steven was looking for a kid for this upcoming film. And, he tossed my hat in the ring, put a clip together, and Universal was kind of behind the idea. So when I was doing ADR for Raggedy Man in 1981, I had an audition with Spielberg for E.T.
And your audition tape, if I recall, is in itself kind of iconic and probably one of the more famous audition tapes in Hollywood history. Where did that wellspring of passion and emotion that you brought to that audition come from? I mean, when you watch that tape, I mean, it's solid. I mean, it's very real. Like, you were Elliot already.
Yeah, thanks. I don't know. I guess I always had that that kind of emotional depth as a kid. I don't know what it was from. Maybe it was from being alone in the middle of nowhere in Texas and pretending to be dead so that the buzzards would land near me and I could look at them, like that kind of thing. Maybe that's where it all comes from. I'm not sure.
Now, was that ad-libbed?
Yeah, that was an improv that you see on the YouTube audition. It's basically the tail end of the audition process, because they had given me a page of dialogue to read in this kind of mock scene that wasn't in ET at all, but it was just kind of this cobbled together scene so they could test the kid's range, I suppose. And anyway, I did a horrible reading, I felt. And so when you see me the first time I'm on camera in the audition, that's right after I've given this horrible reading, in my opinion. So I have this kind of downcast look on my face in the first place. And I had thought, well, I lost this part. I didn't read it very well. So I think that also helped spur on some of the emotional outpouring that happens in the latter half of the improv. When you find out that you got the job, is that like a moment that's permanently seared into your memory? Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah, because that never happens. Even if they know you have the job, they don't say that, because a lot of things can go wrong legally between then and production. So it's not always wise to say that, because then you have a screaming actor at the end of the day going, but they told me I had the part. Were your parents ever concerned about you taking on such a big role at such a young age? Yeah, my mom and my dad was less concerned. My dad kind of viewed it as, it was kind of like we were the Beverly Hillbillies or something. And we had accidentally stumbled upon this black gold. But my mom was kind of wary of the whole thing. My dad was ready to quit his job and move to California. He was like, yeah, that's great. We're cashing in on him. Yeah. And my mom was like, no, you're not. You're going to work your job and you're going to keep it. And this could all disappear tomorrow. And she was right. So. And now, if I'm not mistaken, and a lot of people would know this, Harrison Ford, he was originally in but got cut? So Melissa Matheson was the screenwriter of E.T., and she and Harrison Ford lived together and, had been together for years. And Steven was constantly trying to convince Harrison to do a bit part in the film. And Harrison kept refusing. And finally he said, okay, well, I'll do this part of the principal in the office when Elliot gets taken into the office after releasing all the frogs. He has in the script, he had this conversation with the principal, and the principal was played by Harrison Ford. Very exciting day on set for me. And at that time, he was one of the coolest guys on the planet. I mean, he still is. Oh, and for me, I was a huge Star Wars fan. That was the whole impetus for me wanting to be an actor in the first place, wanting to be in films. I saw Star Wars in the theater and I thought, wow, that's amazing. People do that as a job. And I thought, I want to do that. That seems like fun. And Harrison Ford, to me, became like the iconic movie star with roles characters like Han Solo, and then Indiana Jones,
Yeah.
and and I also saw all of the other films that he was in, like Cisco Kid, and of course American Graffiti, and even, I can't remember it now, but I found the film that he was in where he was an extra. He's like a bellhop or something in the hotel lobby. So as a kid, that was a huge moment for me, and I just I was so disappointed when it wasn't in the film, because I wanted to tell my friends I'm on the screen with Han Solo.
Well, that makes me think of a question. Those days, being a kid, working with Steven Spielberg, and on a movie any kid would die for, what was your life like in that period? I mean, were you having to learn and go to school on set, or did you actually still go to school somewhere else? I know that you're from Texas, but I mean, did you have to go to a school? Did you have to learn on set? How did that work?
Yeah, so the way it works when you're a kid, under the labor laws, you work for your total day will be 8 hours, right? And that will be comprised of 3 hours of school, 1 hour of lunch, and 4 hours of filming. But it doesn't always work out that way, because on the days that you aren't working, you might go to school for extra hours to bank hours on days where they need to film, and they need you more than they need anybody else, and they kind of cut corners and get around the legalities of it like that. Like, you can bank hours and use them at a later date. But as a kid, school was always something that I did as an afterthought. Like, it was always about my job and making the movie, and school, I gotta go to school, I gotta do the school thing. So I didn't really take my academics as seriously as I should have, I think.
Now, I heard Steven Spielberg's kind of like a child on set in many ways. Is that true?
That is true. Yeah. I mean, he's a child in the sense that he's excited and invested in everything in a way that kind of excludes anything outside of what he's focused on. And it's kind of amazing, because I feel like he would do every job on set if he had the opportunity to. If he had the chance to be an actor as well as the camera operator and the boom operator, he would do it all.
That's a little Tarantino-esque.
But it's that whole thing of, he is completely immersed in the process, and that's what he wants to do. He wants to make that story come true.
And there's no better way to do it when you exercise that level of control in so many different areas, because that way you make sure your vision really.
True. It's true.
Now, how did he come across to you and Drew Barrymore and the other kids? I mean, how was he able to elicit such stellar performances from children?
Well, he had a great way of communicating to kids that didn't make you feel like he was an adult talking down to you. He felt kind of like a co-conspirator. You were a collaborator. You weren't some kid, and you guys were doing something special together. It was really cool. So when Steven would come up and give you a note, it was to serve the story always. And we were always about, getting the best of what we could get on film. That was the goal.
How did you and the cast interact with E.T.? I mean, was it hard to interact with essentially a puppet and make it believable, especially at that young age? Or did it seem easier for that because when you're a kid, there's more make-believe and what have you?
Yeah, I mean, in a way, you can sort of gloss over certain things as a kid, I think a little bit more easily, or it's more believable when a kid does it anyway. But it was difficult for me at times because I had a lot of emotional scenes with this puppet, and I had to make that all happen, which was easy within the framework of the world because, you know, E.T. becomes very important to the character and vice versa. And, you know, so as an actor, I was able to do it. As a young performer, I was able to do it. But I was never under the impression that, oh, this is a real creature. And,
Yeah.
you know, but, you know, Drew Barrymore was young enough at the time that the veil between reality and fantasy wasn't quite so intact. And so she imagined the puppet as being real sometimes and would talk to him and wrap a scarf around his neck and worry about what he was going to have for lunch and things like that.
The first time you saw the film, was that at a private screening? Was that in a theater? Was that in the debut of it? When did you first see it, and what do you remember about that first time you saw it in its completed form?
It was a premiere in Houston, Texas, and it was the first time I had seen it, and I saw it with an audience, and I was blown away by the audience's reaction. Because, you know, when you make a film, it's piecemeal and it's kind of like watching paint dry. And especially in those days when there wasn't playback or anything like that, you know, it's just like a guy with a camera going, okay, well, we've got it. I think, you know, we'll know in a few days.
Yeah, you can't go back and look at the scene and go, let me see what my expression looks like in that real quick. Whereas now you can just go back and boom, they just, and you look at it, you go, okay, I need to change this right now. Let's do that again. Right.
Or, well, I mean, just the mere fact of, you know, more than one or two people being able to see what's in the frame, you know, that was solely, you know, trust in the operator and the first AC who was pulling focus. You know, that was, you saw in dailies 3 days later whether or not they did a good job, and then if they did a bad job, they were fired and replaced. You know,
and but you might be shooting something over again, which then puts people behind.
Well, yeah, it costs a lot of money, right? So we get it right the first time. It's a different thing now because, you know, now you have a video village where anybody who can see the screen can see what's in the frame and how the shot's tracking, and they can correct it and stop it then and reset it. Yeah, filmmaking has changed a bit technically. I mean, it's still the same. It's the same process. It's just a little bit more finely tuned, I suppose.
When E.T. ship is closing in and taking off, and that John Williams score swells to its crescendo, when you're there watching it yourself the first time, what were you feeling as a kid in that moment?
Well, it's great to be a part of something like that because, especially to see where the audience is at that point, to see it in a theater with an audience is a fantastic experience.
When you look back on all these years, you know, later, what's your favorite memory from working on that film?
I have a lot of memories of working on that film and a lot of favorites. It's funny though, because it's not so much one specific memory as it is the collection of the whole thing. And they're mostly banal, kind of very boring, commonplace, everyday memories, like my dressing room, my bike that I used to ride around the stages and, you know, get yelled at for not being findable, I suppose. Yeah, so, you know, things like that. But it's never anything that was in the film. It's always stuff that happened behind the scenes, yeah.
Before we get into your much more current projects, I would like to ask you about E.T. Came Home for Christmas.
Oh yeah, the commercial.
What a pleasant surprise that was for everyone when they saw that ad for the first time. You know, especially those who are nostalgic. I think that was what, 2019, right?
2019, yeah.
How did it feel for you playing Elliot again, all grown up? And was it as special for you shooting it as it eventually became for people when they saw it like the first time? And I say it because I took the time to watch it again right before this interview, and it still made me feel all warm and fuzzy inside.
Yeah, well, I think, I think it sort of, it satisfied that craving for a sequel without being too indulgent and too saccharine about it.
Yeah, true.
It was just enough, right?
Yeah.
And it fills in enough blanks without being too on the nose. But I think the great thing was that people really responded positively about it. And that made me feel good because, a lot of these things have come across my desk over the years, these like big Super Bowl commercial ideas and things like that. And a lot of them were really ridiculous. And most of them were not okay, I think, with Spielberg. But this one had his stamp of approval. So I felt all right doing it because I think, he's very precious about the film and he keeps it very protected. So I didn't want to do anything to jeopardize that.